Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Marcus Thompson learned this lesson the hard way on a Tuesday evening that started like any other but ended with him flat on his back, staring at fluorescent lights, while a crowd of strangers decided whether to call an ambulance or just laugh at what they'd witnessed. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Marcus had built his entire identity around being the guy who never backed down, the one who commanded respect through size and volume. At 6'2" and 220 pounds, he'd spent years believing that intimidation was a birthright. But, in less than 3 seconds, a woman half his size had turned his world upside down, literally. This is the story of what happens when toxic masculinity meets quiet competence, when assumptions collide with reality, and when one man's journey from aggressor to unconscious spectacle becomes a viral sensation that forces an entire community to question everything they thought they knew about strength, respect, and what it really means to be powerful. The cameras were rolling. The crowd was watching. And Marcus Thompson was about to discover that sometimes the person you should fear most is the one who never raises their voice. Marcus Thompson had always been the biggest guy in every room he entered, and he made sure everyone knew it. At 32 years old, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never really been challenged, never really been told no in a way that mattered. His broad shoulders filled doorways, his deep voice carried across parking lots, and his presence had a way of making conversations stop mid-sentence. The Riverside Community Center had become Marcus's unofficial territory over the past year. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he'd show up for what the Flyers called Community Fitness Night, a free program where locals could access the gym equipment, join group classes, or just hang out in the common area. But Marcus wasn't there for the fitness. He was there because the community center had become his stage, and he loved having an audience. The center was located in a part of town that had seen better days. Once proud brick buildings now housed discount stores and check-cashing places, and the community center itself was a testament to making do with less. The gymnasium floors creaked, the basketball hoops had nets that had seen too many games, and the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical uncertainty that made everyone look slightly green. But, for the residents of this neighborhood, it was their space, their gathering place, and their refuge from the chaos outside. Marcus had grown up 3 blocks away in a house that his grandmother still lived in, surrounded by the same streets he'd walked as a kid. But, somewhere along the way, he'd developed an attitude that suggested he owned not just his childhood memories, but the entire neighborhood itself. He'd never left, never traveled far, never tested himself against the wider world. Instead, he'd become a big fish in an increasingly small pond, and the community center was where he came to remind everyone of his status. On this particular Tuesday evening in October, the air outside carried the crisp bite of autumn, and the community center was busier than usual. The basketball court echoed with the sounds of teenagers running pickup games, their sneakers squeaking against the old wooden floors. In the weight room, a handful of adults worked through their routines with the determination of people trying to stay healthy on a budget. The common area buzzed with conversation as parents waited for their kids to finish activities, elderly residents played cards at folding tables, and volunteers prepared for an evening ESL class. Marcus made his entrance with his usual fanfare. The front door wasn't quite heavy enough to make the dramatic slam he preferred, but he compensated by letting it bang shut behind him as he surveyed his domain. He wore a tank top despite the October chill, his muscled arms on full display, and moved with the deliberate pace of someone who expected others to get out of his way. "Thompson's here," someone muttered, and conversations began to shift. Not because people were happy to see him, but because experience had taught them that Marcus's arrival often meant the peaceful atmosphere was about to change. The community center had a way of bringing together people who might never cross paths elsewhere. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who taught the children's dance class and had been coming to the center for 15 years. She'd raised 4 kids mostly on her own and had the quiet strength that comes from surviving disappointment and emerging with grace intact. There was Jerome, a veteran in his 50s who used the weight room to manage PTSD and chronic pain, working out with the methodical intensity of someone for whom physical fitness was medicine, not vanity. Then, there was Sarah Chen. Sarah was 28 years old, stood about 5'4", and had the kind of unassuming presence that allowed her to move through spaces without drawing attention. She worked as a physical therapist at the hospital across town and came to the community center twice a week to volunteer with the Senior Citizens Chair exercise program. She wore simple clothes, usually scrubs or comfortable workout gear, and had pulled her dark hair back in a practical ponytail that suggested function over fashion. What people didn't know about Sarah, what she'd never felt the need to advertise, was that she'd been training in martial arts since she was 12 years old. Her father, a second-generation Korean American who'd opened a small taekwondo school above a Chinese restaurant, had insisted that both his daughters learn to protect themselves. But Sarah had taken to it with a natural aptitude that surprised everyone, including herself. By the time she was 18, she held a black belt in taekwondo and had started cross-training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. In college, she joined the judo club and discovered an affinity for throws and ground control that complemented her striking background. But Sarah had never been interested in competition or demonstration. For her, martial arts was personal, a form of meditation, physical fitness, and, yes, self-protection, but not something she felt compelled to discuss or display. This philosophy had served her well in her professional life. As a physical therapist, she understood bodies and movement in ways that went beyond her martial arts training. She could read posture, identify compensatory patterns, and understand the subtle signs that someone was in pain or favoring an injury. She also had an intuitive grasp of biomechanics that allowed her to see how force traveled through the human frame and where the most efficient leverage points were located. Sarah had noticed Marcus from her first week volunteering at the community center. It was hard not to notice him. He had a habit of inserting himself into conversations, standing too close to people when he talked, and using his physical presence to establish dominance in social situations. She'd watched him intimidate teenagers who were just trying to play basketball, interrupt the elderly card players with loud commentary about their games, and make inappropriate comments to women who were clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to respond. The staff at the community center had spoken to Marcus multiple times about his behavior. The director, a soft-spoken woman named Linda who'd been running the place for 12 years, had tried everything from gentle conversations to formal warnings. But Marcus had a way of pushing right up to the line without quite crossing it, and he seemed to understand exactly how much he could get away with before facing real consequences. The truth was, most people were simply afraid of him. Not because he'd ever actually hit anyone at the community center, but because his entire presentation suggested that he was capable of violence and looking for an excuse to demonstrate it. He made comments about teaching people respect, spoke admiringly about fights he claimed to have won, and had a habit of getting very close to people's faces when he felt they weren't paying him sufficient attention. On this Tuesday evening, Marcus was in particularly fine form. He'd started by interrupting the teenagers' basketball game to demonstrate what he called real defense, essentially using his size and weight to prevent smaller players from moving around the court. When one of the kids, a 15-year-old named David, politely suggested that maybe the adults should let them finish their game, Marcus had laughed and made a comment about kids these days not understanding respect. The incident that would change everything started in the most mundane way possible. Sarah was in the common area, helping Mrs. Rodriguez set up chairs for the evening's activities, when she noticed that David looked shaken. The teenager was sitting by himself near the vending machines, his basketball abandoned beside him, clearly trying to process what had just happened on the court. "You okay?" Sarah asked quietly, crouching down to David's eye level. David looked up, surprised that an adult was checking on him. "Yeah, I guess. That guy he's really intense, you know?" Sarah nodded. She did know. She'd been watching Marcus's behavior for months, and she'd seen how it affected the other people who came to the community center. The teenagers who stopped showing up because they didn't want to deal with his interruptions. The elderly residents who chose different times to visit because they didn't want to navigate around his disruptions. The women who brought friends for safety in numbers because they'd learned that Marcus had a pattern of making them uncomfortable. "Mr. Thompson can be a lot to handle," Sarah said diplomatically. "But don't let him keep you from playing ball, okay? You've got every right to be here." David nodded, but Sarah could see that the damage was already done. The kid's confidence had been shaken, and that was exactly what Marcus intended. It was a pattern she'd observed repeatedly. Marcus would use his physical presence and aggressive personality to establish dominance, making others feel small and unwelcome in a space that was supposed to belong to the entire community. What happened next would later be debated by everyone who witnessed it, analyzed frame by frame in the cell phone videos that captured the incident, and discussed in online forums where people argued about everything from gender dynamics to community responsibility. But, in the moment, it unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a train wreck that everyone could see coming but no one seemed able to prevent. Marcus had finished with the basketball court and was making his rounds through the common area. He moved with the territorial confidence of someone marking his domain, making loud observations about the activities, inserting himself into conversations, and generally making his presence felt. When he reached the area where Sarah was still talking quietly with David, he stopped and looked down at them with the expression of someone who'd discovered an interesting situation. "Everything okay over here?" Marcus asked, but his tone suggested that he wasn't really asking. He was announcing his arrival and expecting attention. Sarah looked up calmly. "We're fine, thanks." But Marcus didn't move along as most people would have. Instead, he stepped closer, his shadow falling across both Sarah and David. "Kid looks pretty upset. What's the problem?" There was something in his voice that suggested he already knew exactly what the problem was, and that he was enjoying the opportunity to address it directly. Sarah felt the familiar tension that came when a situation was about to escalate, and she made a quick calculation about her options. She could defuse things with a non-committal answer, probably get David to safety, and avoid confrontation. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, and the one that most people in her situation would have made. But, as she looked at David's face, and thought about all the other people who'd been intimidated or driven away by Marcus's behavior, Sarah realized that she'd reached her limit. "The problem," she said quietly, standing to face Marcus, "is that some people think being big gives them the right to push others around." The common area grew quiet. Conversations stopped. Even the sound from the basketball court seemed to fade as people sensed that something significant was happening. Marcus looked down at Sarah, his expression shifting from amusement to something harder. "Is that so?" he said, taking another step closer. "And what exactly do you think should be done about that?" Sarah didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked up at Marcus with the calm expression of someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to accept the consequences. "I think people who can't control themselves shouldn't take it out on others," she said. Marcus's face darkened. The mask of casual intimidation slipped, replaced by something more genuine and more dangerous. Around them, people began to sense that the situation was moving beyond normal community center drama into territory that might require intervention. Someone pulled out their phone. Others started looking around for staff members. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to the threatening rumble he used when he really wanted to intimidate someone. "You don't know when to keep your mouth shut." He took another step closer, now standing well inside Sarah's personal space, using his height and bulk to loom over her in a way that had worked to establish dominance countless times before. But, this time, something was different. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't break eye contact or show any of the signs of intimidation that Marcus was used to seeing. Instead, she simply stood there, balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands relaxed at her sides, watching him with the calm attention of someone who was reading a situation and preparing to respond. "Maybe you should step back," she said quietly. Marcus laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Or what? You gonna make me?" The challenge hung in the air between them like a live wire. Everyone in the common area was watching now, sensing that they were witnessing one of those moments that would be remembered and retold, one way or another. Sarah looked up at Marcus for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke just 2 words, so quietly that only Marcus and the people closest to them could hear, if necessary. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. In his entire adult life, no one had ever responded to his intimidation tactics with such calm certainty. People either backed down immediately or responded with anger and bluster that he could easily overwhelm. But Sarah's response was something entirely different. It was the quiet confidence of someone who genuinely wasn't afraid of him. For just a moment, Marcus hesitated. Some instinct, some survival mechanism that had kept his species alive for millennia, was sending warning signals that he couldn't quite interpret. But his ego, his entire identity built around physical dominance and intimidation, couldn't process the possibility that this small, quiet woman might actually represent a threat. So he made the choice that would define the rest of his evening, and possibly the rest of his life. Marcus reached out and grabbed Sarah's arm. The moment Marcus's hand closed around Sarah's arm, time seemed to slow down in that way it does when significant events are unfolding. For Marcus, it was supposed to be a simple demonstration of power: grab her arm, establish physical dominance, watch her back down like everyone else always did. He'd done variations of this move dozens of times before, with men and women, teenagers and adults, and it had never failed to produce the desired result: immediate submission and the satisfying confirmation of his place in the social hierarchy. But Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment. The instant she felt Marcus's fingers wrap around her forearm, her training took over. 12 years of Taekwondo, 6 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, 4 years of Judo, and countless hours of practice had built neural pathways that responded faster than conscious thought. Her body understood what was happening and what needed to happen next before her mind had even finished processing the situation. What Marcus didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood based on his limited experience with actual combat, was that grabbing someone who knows how to fight is like pulling the pin on a grenade. Sarah's entire martial arts education had been built around the principle that real self-defense begins when someone puts their hands on you without permission. Everything up until that moment was just conversation. Sarah's response was both lightning fast and precisely controlled. Her free hand came up and grasped Marcus's wrist, not to pull away but to secure his grip exactly where it was. At the same time, she pivoted on her right foot, stepping slightly to the side and rotating her body in a movement so smooth it looked almost like dancing. The combination of these actions created a mechanical advantage that Marcus, despite his size and strength, was powerless to resist. What happened next was a textbook demonstration of what martial artists call using your opponent's energy against them. Marcus had grabbed Sarah's arm expecting her to pull away, to struggle against his grip, to create the kind of strength-against-strength contest that his size and muscle mass would inevitably win. Instead, Sarah moved with his grip, redirected his force, and turned his own momentum into the weapon that would defeat him. The throw was a modified sui nage, a shoulder throw that Sarah had practiced thousands of times but never used in real combat. She ducked under Marcus's extended arm, positioned her shoulder against his midsection, and used her legs and hips to generate the leverage needed to lift and throw a man nearly twice her size. The physics were simple and unavoidable: proper technique and timing beat size and strength every time, assuming the person applying the technique knew what they were doing. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. Marcus found himself airborne before his brain could process what was happening. One moment he was standing on solid ground, confident in his ability to intimidate and control the situation, and the next moment he was flying through the air with no idea how he'd gotten there or where he was going to land. The sensation was so completely foreign to his experience that he didn't even think to break his fall properly. He hit the floor with the sound that a 220-pound man makes when he encounters linoleum at high speed. The impact was loud enough to echo through the community center, stopping conversations in rooms that were 50 feet away and causing heads to turn throughout the building. Marcus's back struck the floor first, followed immediately by his head, creating a two-part percussion that made everyone within earshot wince in sympathetic pain. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus lay on his back, staring up at the fluorescent lights that had seemed so much further away just moments before. His vision was blurry, his head was ringing, and his body was sending confused signals about pain and position that his brain couldn't quite organize into coherent thoughts. He tried to sit up and discovered that his equilibrium was completely shot. The room spun sickeningly whenever he moved his head, and his arms felt like they belonged to someone else. Above him, Sarah stood in the same spot where the confrontation had begun, her breathing steady, her expression calm. She looked down at Marcus not with triumph or satisfaction, but with the neutral attention of someone who was monitoring a situation to determine if further action was necessary. Her hands were back at her sides, her posture relaxed, and if not for the man lying unconscious at her feet, an observer might have thought nothing had happened at all. The crowd that had gathered began to react. Some people moved closer to get a better look at Marcus, others pulled out their phones to record what had already become the most dramatic incident in the community center's 12-year history. A few started calling for someone to check if Marcus was seriously injured, while others debated whether they should call an ambulance or the police or both. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire confrontation from the beginning, was the first person to speak into the silence. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for years to see Marcus get his comeuppance, "that was a long time coming." Her comments seemed to break the spell, and, suddenly, everyone was talking at once. People who had been intimidated by Marcus for months began sharing stories about his behavior, his threats, his pattern of making the community center an uncomfortable place for anyone who didn't want to cater to his ego. Others expressed shock at the speed and efficiency with which Sarah had handled the situation, marveling at how someone so small had managed to throw someone so large with such apparent ease. But, perhaps the most telling reactions came from the people who knew Marcus best. Jerome, the veteran who'd been working out in the weight room, appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who'd heard the crash and come to investigate. When he saw Marcus on the floor and Sarah standing calmly nearby, he didn't ask what had happened or express surprise at the outcome. Instead, he nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had finally been confirmed. "Always wondered when someone was going to call his bluff," Jerome said to no one in particular. "Figured it was just a matter of time." Linda, the community center director, arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion and the crowd of people gathered in the common area. She took one look at the scene, Marcus still lying on the floor, clearly dazed but beginning to show signs of consciousness, and Sarah standing nearby looking like she'd done nothing more dramatic than help someone move furniture, and sighed with the weariness of someone who'd been dreading this moment for months. "What happened here?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested that she had a pretty good idea. The explanation came from multiple sources at once. David, the teenager who'd been intimidated earlier, spoke up first, describing how Marcus had been disrupting the basketball game and then confronted Sarah when she tried to comfort him. Mrs. Rodriguez provided a detailed account of the verbal confrontation, emphasizing how Marcus had invaded Sarah's personal space and grabbed her arm. Jerome added his perspective as someone who'd observed Marcus's pattern of behavior over many months. Through it all, Sarah remained quiet. She didn't interrupt or correct anyone's account, didn't defend her actions or explain her background, didn't seem interested in claiming credit or deflecting blame. She simply stood there with the calm patience of someone who understood that the situation would speak for itself. When Linda finally turned to Sarah for her version of events, Sarah's response was characteristically brief. "He grabbed my arm," she said. "I defended myself." Linda looked from Sarah to Marcus, who was now sitting up but still clearly struggling with dizziness and confusion. As the director of the community center, she'd dealt with plenty of conflicts over the years, but nothing quite like this. The legal implications alone were enough to make her head spin: assault charges, liability issues, insurance claims, and the potential for the incident to become a public relations nightmare for the center. But Linda also understood something that would become clearer to everyone else in the days to come: this incident hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the inevitable result of months of escalating behavior that the community center staff had struggled to address through conventional means. Marcus had been warned, counseled, temporarily banned, and given more second chances than most people would have received, but he'd continued to push boundaries and intimidate other visitors. Now, finally, he'd pushed the wrong person. The paramedics arrived about 10 minutes later, called by someone who'd been worried about the force of Marcus's impact with the floor. They found him sitting upright but still disoriented, complaining of a headache and nausea that suggested a possible concussion. The EMTs performed a quick assessment, checking his pupils, testing his balance, and asking questions designed to evaluate his cognitive function. Marcus answered their questions correctly but slowly, clearly struggling to process information at his normal speed. When they asked what had happened, he looked around the room with the confused expression of someone trying to remember a dream, his gaze eventually settling on Sarah with obvious bewilderment. How did she?" He started to say, then stopped, apparently unable to complete the thought. One of the EMTs, a woman in her 40s who'd been working emergency medicine for 15 years, looked at the scene with professional interest. She'd responded to plenty of bar fights, domestic violence calls, and random acts of violence, and she could usually reconstruct what had happened based on the injuries and the positioning of the people involved. But this situation was unusual enough to catch her attention. "So you got thrown?" she asked Marcus. Marcus nodded slowly, then winced as the movement aggravated his headache. The EMT looked at Sarah, taking in her small frame and calm demeanor. "Martial arts?" Sarah nodded once. "Huh," the EMT said, making a note on her report. "Don't see that very often. Usually when we get called for throws, it's two drunk guys who don't know what they're doing. This looks a lot more professional." The comment hung in the air as people began to realize that they'd witnessed something genuinely rare. Most fights, even when they involve trained fighters, are messy affairs full of missed punches, grappling, and extended struggles. What they'd just seen was something entirely different, a single, perfectly executed technique that had ended the confrontation in less than 3 seconds. Marcus was eventually loaded onto a stretcher and taken to the hospital for further evaluation. As the paramedics wheeled him out, he kept looking back at Sarah with an expression that mixed confusion with something that might have been respect. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus had encountered someone who was genuinely more capable than he was, and his worldview was struggling to accommodate this new information. After Marcus left, the community center slowly returned to its normal activities. The teenagers resumed their basketball game, the elderly residents went back to their card games, and the volunteers continued setting up for the evening's programs. But there was an energy in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense of relief, validation, and possibility that had been missing for months. Sarah helped Mrs. Rodriguez finish setting up chairs for the dance class, packed her things quietly, and prepared to leave. She'd accomplished what she came to do, volunteered with the Senior Citizens Program, and had no interest in lingering to become the center of attention or to relive the incident with curious observers. But, as she reached the front door, Linda caught up with her. "Sarah," the director said, "I need to ask, are you okay? I mean, I know you handled yourself well, but something like this can be traumatic even when you come out on top." Sarah paused, considering the question seriously. The truth was, she felt fine. Better than fine, actually. For months, she'd watched Marcus intimidate people who couldn't defend themselves, and she'd struggled with the knowledge that she had the ability to stop him but questioned whether she had the right to intervene. Now that the moment had come and she'd responded instinctively to protect herself, she felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. "I'm fine," she told Linda. "But I think you should know, I didn't plan this. I don't go around looking for fights. But I also won't let someone put their hands on me without permission." Linda nodded. As the director of a community center in a neighborhood that had its share of challenges, she understood the distinction Sarah was making. There was a difference between someone who went looking for trouble and someone who was prepared to handle trouble when it found them. "Will you still be volunteering?" Linda asked. Sarah smiled for the first time all evening. "Of course. Mrs. Rodriguez's class needs those chairs set up, right?" As Sarah left the community center and walked to her car, she was unaware that cell phone videos of the incident were already being uploaded to social media. She didn't know that by morning, she would be the subject of hundreds of online discussions about self-defense, gender dynamics, and community responsibility. She had no idea that Marcus Thompson's encounter with the floor would become a viral sensation that sparked debates about toxic masculinity, martial arts training, and the importance of standing up to bullies. All Sarah knew was that she'd defended herself when someone had put their hands on her without permission, and she'd done exactly what her training had taught her to do. The rest, she figured, would sort itself out. But the story was just beginning. By Wednesday morning, Sarah Chen had become an internet sensation without even knowing it. The first video had been uploaded to Twitter at 9:47 p.m. the previous night by David, the teenager who'd been intimidated by Marcus earlier in the evening. His caption was simple: "This bully has been terrorizing our community center for months. Finally, met his match tonight. #justice served #self-defense." The video was shaky, shot from about 15 feet away, but it captured the essential elements of the confrontation: Marcus grabbing Sarah's arm, Sarah's lightning-fast response, and Marcus hitting the floor with devastating finality. Within 3 hours, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. By midnight, it had reached 200,000 views and been shared by dozens of larger accounts. By 3 a.m., it was trending on Twitter with the hashtag #CommunityJustice, and reaction videos were already being posted by martial arts instructors, self-defense advocates, and social commentators who'd found their next viral moment. Sarah discovered her newfound fame when she arrived at work Wednesday morning and found her phone buzzing with notifications from social media platforms she barely used. Her initial reaction was confusion. Why was she suddenly getting friend requests from strangers, and what were all these people tagging her in? It wasn't until she clicked on one of the links that she saw herself throwing Marcus Thompson across the community center floor, watched from the perspective of David's cell phone camera. The video was surreal to watch. Sarah remembered every detail of the incident clearly, but seeing it from an outside perspective was jarring. The throw looked even more dramatic on camera than it had felt in real life, and Marcus's impact with the floor sounded more violent than she'd realized at the time. But what surprised her most was how calm she looked throughout the entire confrontation. Even she hadn't realized how composed she'd appeared while dealing with Marcus's intimidation and the aftermath of the throw. The comments section under the video was a battlefield of opinions. Supporters praised Sarah for standing up to a bully and demonstrating that physical intimidation doesn't work against someone with proper training. Critics questioned whether throwing someone was an appropriate response to being grabbed, debated the legal implications of the incident, and argued about whether Sarah had used excessive force. Martial arts practitioners analyzed the technique, identifying it as a textbook shoulder throw and marveling at the precision of the execution. But the conversation that really caught Sarah's attention was happening among women who'd shared their own stories of being intimidated, harassed, or threatened by men who used their size and strength to control others. Hundreds of comments described similar situations where women had been made to feel unsafe or unwelcome in public spaces by men like Marcus, and many expressed vicarious satisfaction at seeing such behavior meet immediate and decisive consequences. One comment in particular stood out: "I wish I'd had the courage to do what she did when my ex-husband used to grab me like that. Thank you for showing us what standing up for yourself looks like." Sarah stared at that comment for a long time, realizing that her split-second decision to defend herself had somehow become a symbol for people who'd felt powerless in similar situations. It wasn't a role she'd asked for or particularly wanted, but she was beginning to understand that the incident had meaning beyond just one evening at a community center. The story gained even more momentum when Jerome, the veteran from the community center, posted his own video on Facebook. Unlike David's shaky phone footage, Jerome's account was a thoughtful, articulate description of Marcus's pattern of behavior and the community's failed attempts to address it through normal channels. He provided context that the original video lacked, explaining how Marcus had been intimidating people for months and describing the relief that everyone felt after Sarah's intervention. "This wasn't about a woman attacking a man," Jerome said in his video, speaking directly to the camera with the authority of someone who'd seen real combat. "This was about a trained individual defending herself against an aggressor who'd been terrorizing our community space. Marcus Thompson chose to put his hands on someone without permission, and he learned a valuable lesson about the consequences of that choice. Sometimes bullies only understand one language, and last night they finally got a translator." Jerome's video added credibility to Sarah's actions and helped shift the narrative away from gender dynamics toward community self-defense. As a military veteran and someone who'd been present for Marcus's previous incidents, Jerome's testimony carried weight with people who might otherwise have questioned whether Sarah's response was justified. Meanwhile, at Riverside General Hospital, Marcus was dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of his encounter with Sarah. The medical evaluation had confirmed a mild concussion, along with bruised ribs and a severely bruised ego. But more challenging than his physical injuries was his struggle to process what had actually happened to him. Marcus had built his entire adult identity around being the person who never backed down, never lost a fight, never showed weakness or vulnerability. His self-image was inextricably linked to his ability to intimidate others and control social situations through the implicit threat of violence. But Sarah had shattered that identity in less than 3 seconds, and Marcus was discovering that he had no framework for understanding himself as someone who could be defeated by a woman half his size. The nurses treating him had been professional but distant, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they'd already seen the video and were judging him based on what they'd witnessed. When the doctor asked how his injuries had occurred, Marcus found himself struggling to explain. Saying "I got thrown by a small woman" felt like admitting to a fundamental failure of masculinity that he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. But the real reckoning came when Marcus's phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends, family members, and acquaintances had seen the video, and their reactions ranged from concern to amusement to outright mockery. His cousin sent him a link to the video with the message, "Dude, you got wrecked by a girl. How does that even happen?" His ex-girlfriend shared the video on her own social media with the caption, "Finally, someone stood up to this bully. Wish I'd had the guts when we were together." That last comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd never thought of himself as a bully in his relationship with Carla. Sure, he'd raised his voice sometimes, gotten in her face during arguments, used his size to make points during disagreements. But he'd never actually hit her, never thought of his behavior as abusive or intimidating. Seeing himself described that way by someone who'd been intimate with him for 2 years forced Marcus to confront the possibility that his understanding of his own behavior was fundamentally flawed. As the video continued to spread, it caught the attention of larger media outlets. Local news stations picked up the story first, framing it as a feel-good tale about community self-defense and the power of martial arts training. The interviews they conducted with community center members painted Marcus as a long-standing problem and Sarah as an unlikely hero who'd finally restored peace to a neighborhood gathering place. National media followed quickly, with cable news shows using the video as a jumping-off point for discussions about toxic masculinity, self-defense laws, and the effectiveness of martial arts training for personal protection. Self-defense instructors reported a surge in inquiries from people wanting to learn techniques like the one Sarah had demonstrated. Martial arts schools began using the video in their marketing materials, promoting the practical benefits of their training programs. But the story took an unexpected turn when Sarah agreed to be interviewed by a local television station. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Martinez who'd been covering community interest stories for 3 years, approached the interview expecting to find someone who was enjoying her moment in the spotlight. Instead, she found Sarah in her scrubs after a long shift at the hospital, tired but willing to talk about the incident if it might help other people understand what had happened. "I want to be clear about something," Sarah said during the interview. "I didn't throw that man because I wanted to hurt him or because I was angry. I threw him because he grabbed my arm without permission, and my training taught me to respond to that kind of physical aggression. If someone puts their hands on you, you have the right to defend yourself. But you also have the responsibility to use only the force necessary to stop the threat." The interviewer asked Sarah about her martial arts background, and, for the first time publicly, Sarah talked about her father's insistence that both his daughters learn to protect themselves, her years of training, and her philosophy about self-defense being a tool for protection rather than aggression. "People keep asking me if I was scared," Sarah said. "The truth is, I wasn't scared because I knew I could handle the situation. But I also wasn't looking for a fight. If Marcus had stepped back when I asked him to, none of this would have happened. The throw was his choice as much as mine." The interview humanized Sarah in ways that the viral video couldn't. Viewers saw her as a healthcare professional who volunteered at a community center, not as a martial arts warrior looking for opportunities to demonstrate her skills. They heard her speak with respect about her training and her instructors, and with genuine concern for the safety of other community center visitors who'd been intimidated by Marcus's behavior. But, perhaps most importantly, they heard her acknowledge that what had happened was serious and that she took no pleasure in having to hurt someone, even someone who'd been threatening her. The interview also included comments from Linda, the community center director, who provided additional context about Marcus's pattern of behavior and the staff's unsuccessful attempts to address it. Linda's description of months of complaints, warnings, and failed interventions helped viewers understand that Sarah's response hadn't occurred in a vacuum, but was the result of a situation that had been building for a long time. "We tried everything we could think of," Linda said. Conversations, warnings, temporary bans, mediation sessions. But Marcus always found ways to push right up to the line without quite crossing it. Until Tuesday night, when he finally crossed it with the wrong person. As the story continued to evolve, it became clear that the incident had touched on deeper cultural issues about power, respect, and accountability. Social media discussions expanded beyond the specific details of what had happened to broader conversations about toxic masculinity, the importance of consent, and the right to defend oneself against intimidation. Women shared stories about times they'd been grabbed, cornered, or intimidated by men who used their physical advantages to control situations. Men talked about learning to recognize and modify their own behavior after seeing how Marcus's actions had been perceived by others. Parents discussed the importance of teaching children about consent and respect for others' boundaries. The video also sparked conversations within martial arts communities about the responsibility that comes with self-defense training. Instructors used the incident as a teaching moment, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation, proportional response, and the legal and ethical implications of using physical techniques in real-world situations. But, while Sarah was becoming a symbol for self-empowerment and community justice, Marcus was experiencing the darker side of internet fame. The video had been viewed millions of times, and not all of the attention was sympathetic. Memes featuring his fall had spread across social media, often accompanied by mocking commentary about his size, his behavior, and his apparent surprise at Sarah's capabilities. The incident had also affected his employment. Marcus worked as a forklift operator at a warehouse across town, and his supervisor had called him into the office Wednesday afternoon after seeing the video. The company was concerned about potential liability issues and the negative publicity associated with having an employee who'd gained notoriety for intimidating people at a community center. "We're not firing you," his supervisor had explained. "But we're recommending that you take some time off, maybe get some counseling, and think about how you want to handle this situation moving forward." Marcus had left work that afternoon feeling like his entire world was collapsing. His identity, his relationships, his reputation, and now his employment were all being affected by 3 seconds of video that had captured the worst moment of his life and broadcast it to millions of strangers. But perhaps the most difficult part of the experience was the growing realization that most people who knew him personally weren't surprised by what they'd seen. Friends, family members, and co-workers had watched the video with reactions that ranged from "I always knew he'd get his comeuppance eventually" to "she should have thrown him harder." Very few people had expressed sympathy for Marcus or suggested that Sarah's response had been inappropriate. That evening, as Sarah finished her volunteer shift at the community center, she was struck by how different the atmosphere felt. The space seemed more relaxed, more welcoming, and more genuinely communal than it had in months. Teenagers were playing basketball without looking over their shoulders. Elderly residents were chatting comfortably without worrying about disruptions. The staff moved through their duties with a lightness that hadn't been present when they were constantly monitoring Marcus's behavior and managing his impact on other visitors. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was preparing to leave. "I wanted to thank you," the older woman said. "Not just for what you did Tuesday night, but for showing all of us that we don't have to accept being intimidated. My granddaughter saw the video, and she asked me to teach her some of those moves you used. I told her that's a good idea, that every woman should know how to protect herself." Sarah nodded, understanding that the incident had created ripple effects she was still discovering. The viral video had made her a symbol, but, more importantly, it had started conversations about consent, respect, and self-defense that were extending far beyond the community center. As she drove home Wednesday night, Sarah reflected on how quickly her life had changed. 3 days ago, she'd been an anonymous physical therapist who volunteered at a community center. Now she was the subject of national news stories and social media debates. But, despite the attention and the sudden fame, she felt confident that she'd done the right thing. Marcus Thompson had made a choice when he grabbed her arm. Sarah had simply responded to that choice with the training and skills she possessed. The consequences that followed, the viral video, the public scrutiny, the cultural conversations, were the result of Marcus's actions, not hers. But, as Sarah would soon discover, the story was far from over. The viral video had set events in motion that would continue to unfold for weeks to come, affecting not just her own life and Marcus's, but the entire community that had witnessed their 3-second encounter and its far-reaching aftermath. The legal implications of what had happened at the community center became clear on Thursday morning when Marcus Thompson retained an attorney and filed assault charges against Sarah Chen. The decision surprised many people who'd followed the story, including the police officers who'd reviewed the video evidence and initially concluded that Sarah had acted in clear self-defense. But Marcus's lawyer, a personal injury specialist named Robert Kelman who'd built his practice on aggressive litigation tactics, saw an opportunity to reframe the narrative. "My client was the victim of a vicious, unprovoked attack," Kelman announced at a hastily arranged press conference outside the courthouse. "Mr. Thompson is suffering from a concussion and other injuries inflicted by someone who clearly has extensive training in violent techniques. The fact that this incident has been celebrated on social media doesn't change the fact that a serious crime was committed." Kelman's strategy was obvious to anyone familiar with legal theater. He was attempting to shift focus away from Marcus's behavior and onto the severity of Sarah's response, portraying his client as the victim of an assault rather than the instigator of a confrontation. The lawyer emphasized Marcus's injuries, described Sarah's martial arts training as evidence of premeditation, and suggested that a truly innocent person would have tried to de-escalate the situation rather than resorting to violence. The press conference was carefully staged. Marcus appeared in a neck brace and spoke slowly, emphasizing the lingering effects of his concussion. He claimed to have no memory of grabbing Sarah's arm and suggested that whatever he might have done certainly didn't justify being attacked by someone trained to hurt people. Kelman stood beside his client, radiating the confidence of someone who'd found an angle that might generate a significant settlement. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Within hours of the press conference, additional videos of the incident surfaced. Community center visitors who'd been recording the confrontation from different angles provided footage that showed Marcus's approach to Sarah in greater detail, capturing his aggressive body language, his invasion of her personal space, and the clear grabbing motion that had initiated physical contact. More damaging still was audio from one of the videos that picked up Marcus's threatening comments about Sarah not knowing when to keep her mouth shut. The new evidence made it impossible to portray Marcus as an innocent victim who'd been blindsided by an unprovoked attack. Instead, the video showed a pattern of escalating aggression that had culminated in Marcus making the choice to grab someone who'd asked him to step back. Sarah's response looked even more justified when viewed in the complete context of the confrontation. Public reaction to Marcus's legal strategy was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Social media users who'd initially felt some sympathy for a man who'd been embarrassed by a viral video now saw him as someone trying to escape accountability for his own actions. The hashtag victim blaming began trending as people shared stories about times they'd been attacked or intimidated and, then, blamed for defending themselves. More significantly, Marcus's decision to file charges prompted other people who'd been intimidated by him to come forward with their own stories. Over the course of Thursday afternoon, local news stations received calls from more than a dozen community center visitors who described incidents where Marcus had made them feel unsafe or unwelcome. Their accounts painted a picture of systematic intimidation that went far beyond the Tuesday night confrontation with Sarah. Jennifer Reeves, a single mother who'd brought her 8-year-old daughter to the community center for dance classes, described how Marcus had cornered her in the parking lot 2 months earlier after she'd asked him to stop disrupting her daughter's class. "He got right in my face and told me I needed to learn some respect," Jennifer told reporters. "I was terrified. I stopped bringing my daughter to dance class because I was afraid of running into him again." Tom Martinez, a 67-year-old retiree who'd been using the community center's fitness equipment for years, described how Marcus had taken over machines for extended periods and become aggressive when asked to share. "He'd follow people into the locker room and keep arguing if they didn't back down immediately," Tom said. "I saw him make 3 different people cry just in the time I knew him." Most disturbing was the account provided by Rebecca Walsh, a teenage volunteer who'd helped with the community center's after-school program. Rebecca described how Marcus had made inappropriate comments about her appearance and had once followed her to her car, insisting that she give him her phone number. "I was 16, Rebecca said. I didn't know what to do. The adults seemed afraid of him too, so I just started avoiding the community center whenever I knew he'd be there." These testimonies transformed the public perception of what had happened on Tuesday night. Instead of being an isolated incident between 2 individuals, the confrontation began to be understood as the culmination of a pattern of predatory behavior that had been affecting the entire community. Sarah's response wasn't just self-defense, it was community defense, protecting not just herself but all the other people who'd been intimidated into silence or absence by Marcus's behavior. The police department, which had initially treated the incident as a simple assault case, reopened their investigation to examine whether Marcus's pattern of behavior constituted criminal harassment or stalking. Detective Patricia Lawson, who'd been assigned to review the case, spent Thursday afternoon interviewing community center staff and visitors, building a timeline of Marcus's escalating behavior over the previous year. What Detective Lawson discovered was a textbook example of how traditional institutions often fail to address predatory behavior until it escalates to violence. The community center staff had documented numerous complaints about Marcus, but their responses had been limited to verbal warnings and temporary suspensions that Marcus had largely ignored. The police had never been called because Marcus had been careful to keep his behavior just below the threshold that would typically trigger law enforcement involvement. It's a common pattern, Detective Lawson explained to reporters. Predators often understand exactly how far they can push without facing serious consequences. They'll intimidate, threaten, and harass people for months or years, but they're smart enough to stop short of doing anything that would clearly justify arrest. Until they make a mistake. Marcus's mistake had been assuming that Sarah was like his previous victims, someone who would be intimidated by his size and aggression, someone who would submit to his dominance rather than resist it. Instead, he'd encountered someone with the training and confidence to defend herself, and the 3-second confrontation had exposed months of predatory behavior to public scrutiny. The revelation of Marcus's pattern of behavior also had legal implications for the assault charges he'd filed against Sarah. District Attorney Carmen Rodriguez announced Thursday evening that her office would not be pursuing the case against Sarah, citing clear evidence of self-defense and the discovery of Marcus's history of intimidating behavior at the community center. Self-defense is not a crime, Rodriguez said at her own press conference. Ms. Chen was grabbed by someone who had been intimidating people in that space for months. She had every right to defend herself, and she used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop the threat. Mr. Thompson's decision to file charges appears to be an attempt to avoid accountability for his own actions. Instead, Rodriguez announced that her office was considering whether Marcus's pattern of behavior warranted criminal charges for harassment, stalking, or creating a hostile environment. The investigation would examine not just the Tuesday night incident, but the months of intimidation that had preceded it. The legal reversal was a devastating blow to Marcus's attempt to reframe himself as the victim. His lawyer, Robert Kellman, withdrew from the case Thursday night, citing irreconcilable differences with the client, legal speak for recognizing that the case was unwinnable and potentially damaging to his reputation. But the consequences for Marcus extended beyond the legal system. His employer, after conducting their own investigation that included interviews with co-workers about Marcus's workplace behavior, terminated his employment Thursday afternoon. The warehouse manager explained that several female employees had complained about Marcus's inappropriate comments and intimidating behavior, issues that had been overlooked previously but couldn't be ignored in light of the community center incident. Marcus's landlord also took action, delivering a 30-day notice to vacate after other tenants in the building complained about feeling unsafe around him. The viral video had made Marcus recognizable to strangers, and his neighbors were no longer willing to tolerate behavior they'd previously endured in silence. Meanwhile, Sarah was experiencing the positive side of unexpected fame. The hospital where she worked had received dozens of calls from patients and colleagues praising her actions, and several martial arts schools had reached out to offer her teaching opportunities. More importantly to Sarah, the community center had seen a surge in new visitors, people who'd been inspired by the story to get involved in their local community, and others who'd been driven away by Marcus's behavior and were now returning. But Sarah was also grappling with the weight of becoming a symbol for something larger than herself. The interviews, the social media attention, and the constant requests for comment had become overwhelming. She'd taken a few days off from work to process what had happened and to consider how she wanted to handle the ongoing attention. On Friday evening, Sarah returned to the community center for the first time since Tuesday night. She'd been nervous about how people would react to her, whether they'd treat her differently now that she'd become famous. But the reception was exactly what she'd hoped for, warm, grateful, and normal. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged her immediately upon arrival. "How are you holding up, Mija? All this attention must be exhausting. Sarah smiled. It's been interesting. But I'm glad to be back here where things feel normal. The evening proceeded much as it had before the incident, with one crucial difference: the atmosphere was relaxed in a way it hadn't been for months. Parents brought their children to activities without worry. Elderly residents used the facilities without looking over their shoulders. Teenagers played basketball with the confidence of kids who knew they wouldn't be intimidated or harassed. Jerome approached Sarah while she was helping set up chairs for the evening's programs. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Not just for what you did, but for how you've handled everything since. You could have used this attention to promote yourself or get something out of it. Instead, you've kept the focus on protecting people and building community. That takes character." Sarah appreciated Jerome's comment because it reflected something she'd been thinking about throughout the week. The viral video had given her a platform she'd never asked for, and she'd been careful to use it responsibly. Instead of promoting herself or capitalizing on her fame, she tried to keep the conversation focused on consent, self-defense, and community safety. The evening's activities proceeded normally, but Sarah noticed something that filled her with satisfaction: new faces. People who'd never visited the community center before had come to check it out, drawn by the story of a space where someone had finally stood up to a bully. More significantly, some faces had returned, people like Jennifer Reeves and her daughter, who'd come back to dance class for the first time in months. As the evening wound down, Linda approached Sarah with a proposal. "I've been thinking," the director said. "Would you be interested in teaching a self-defense class here? We've had dozens of requests from people who want to learn some of the techniques you used. Nothing aggressive or violent, just basic personal protection skills." Sarah considered the offer. She'd never taught martial arts formally, though she'd helped train newer students at her dojo. The idea of sharing practical self-defense skills with people who'd felt powerless in situations like the one she'd encountered was appealing. "I'd want to focus on de-escalation first," Sarah said. "Physical techniques should be a last resort. But, yes, I think that could be valuable." The self-defense class would become one of the most popular programs in the community center's history, drawing participants from across the city who wanted to learn not just physical techniques, but the confidence and situational awareness that had allowed Sarah to handle Marcus's intimidation so effectively. But the most significant development of the week happened on Saturday morning, when Marcus Thompson called Sarah directly. She almost didn't answer the unknown number, but something prompted her to pick up the phone. Marcus's voice was subdued, lacking the aggressive confidence she remembered from their confrontation. "Sarah? This is Marcus Thompson. From the community center." Sarah was quiet for a moment, unsure what to expect from this conversation. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus continued. "For grabbing you, for threatening you, for everything, really. I've been thinking about this all week, and I realize I've been a real problem for a lot of people." The apology caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even more threats. Instead, Marcus sounded genuinely remorseful and confused about his own behavior. "I keep watching that video," Marcus said, "and I can't believe that's me. I mean, I know it's me, but I don't recognize the person I see. I look like a bully, and I guess I was a bully. I just never thought of myself that way." Sarah listened as Marcus struggled to articulate his realization that his behavior had been affecting people in ways he'd never considered. He talked about the stories that had come out over the past few days, the complaints from community center visitors, and his growing understanding that he'd been making people feel unsafe and unwelcome. "I want to get help," Marcus said. "I want to figure out why I act like that and how to change. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make sure I don't do it again." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of counseling someone who threatened her just days before, helping him understand the impact of his behavior and encouraging his efforts to seek therapy and anger management training. When Marcus asked if she could ever forgive him, Sarah's response reflected the wisdom that had guided her throughout the entire experience. "I can forgive you," she said. "But forgiveness isn't just about saying the words. It's about you doing the work to change, to make sure other people don't have to deal with what I dealt with Tuesday night. Can you do that work? Marcus promised that he would, and, over the following months, he would prove to be as good as his word. But, that part of the story was still to come. As Sarah ended the phone call, she reflected on how the week had unfolded. A 3-second confrontation had exposed months of problematic behavior, sparked national conversations about consent and self-defense, and ultimately created an opportunity for real change in her community. But, perhaps most importantly, it had reminded everyone involved that bullies only have power over people who feel powerless to resist them. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to back down. 6 months after the incident that made him internet famous for all the wrong reasons, Marcus Thompson sat in a small circle of folding chairs at the downtown community counseling center, listening to other men share their stories about anger, violence, and the difficult process of changing behavior that had been years in the making. The anger management group had become the cornerstone of Marcus's attempt to rebuild his life after losing his job, his apartment, and most of his social relationships in the aftermath of his confrontation with Sarah Chen. What had started as a court-mandated requirement following his arrest for harassment had evolved into something Marcus genuinely valued, a space where he could be honest about the person he'd been and get support for the person he was trying to become. "Marcus," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who facilitated the group, "would you like to share what you've learned about your triggers this week?" Marcus nodded, though speaking in the group still made him uncomfortable. For 32 years, he defined masculinity as never showing weakness or vulnerability, never admitting mistakes or asking for help. Learning to talk openly about his emotions and behavior had required dismantling everything he thought he knew about what it meant to be a man. "I realized this week that I used to think respect meant fear," Marcus said slowly. "Like, if people weren't afraid of me, then they didn't respect me. But that's not respect at all. That's just intimidation." The insight had come during a session with his individual therapist, Dr. James Rodriguez, who'd been helping Marcus understand the root causes of his aggressive behavior. Through months of difficult conversations, Marcus had begun to recognize patterns that stretched back to his childhood in a household where his father had used size and volume to control family discussions, and his mother had taught him that backing down from confrontation was a sign of weakness. "I spent my whole life thinking that being big and loud made me important," Marcus continued. "But when I watch that video now, and I still watch it sometimes, even though it hurts, I just see someone who was scared. I was scared that people wouldn't pay attention to me if I wasn't intimidating them." The other men in the group nodded with recognition. They were all there for similar reasons: domestic violence, workplace harassment, bar fights, road rage incidents that had spiraled out of control. They'd all discovered that what they'd thought was strength was actually a symptom of deep insecurity and poor emotional regulation. Marcus's journey to this understanding had been neither quick nor easy. The first few weeks after the incident had been consumed by anger and denial. He blamed Sarah for his injuries, blamed the community center for not protecting him from assault, blamed social media for turning him into a laughingstock. He'd hired the lawyer, filed charges, and convinced himself that he was the victim of an unfair system that sided with women over men. But the collapse of his legal case had forced Marcus to confront the evidence of his own behavior. The videos from multiple angles, the testimony from people he'd intimidated, the documentation of months of complaints that he'd either ignored or forgotten, all of it painted a picture of someone who'd been systematically making other people's lives worse without even realizing it. The breaking point had come when Marcus's mother, who'd defended his behavior for years, watched the viral video and called him crying. "Marcus," she'd said, "I watched that girl throw you, and all I could think was good for her. What kind of mother am I that I felt relieved to see my son get hurt? But, honey, you look just like your father in that video, and I spent 20 years being afraid of your father." That conversation had shattered Marcus's last defense against acknowledging what he'd become. His mother, who'd taught him that real men never back down, was telling him that his behavior had made her think of his abusive father. The comparison was devastating because Marcus had spent his entire adult life promising himself that he would never become the kind of man who made people afraid. But he had become exactly that kind of man, and it had taken a viral video and public humiliation for him to recognize it. The therapy had been court-mandated initially, part of a plea agreement after the district attorney's office filed harassment charges based on Marcus's pattern of behavior at the community center. But what began as a legal requirement had become Marcus's lifeline for understanding and changing behavior that had been destroying his relationships for years. Dr. Rodriguez had helped Marcus understand that his aggressive behavior wasn't just about anger, it was about a fundamental lack of emotional regulation skills and a worldview that treated every social interaction as a competition that he needed to win. Through cognitive behavioral therapy, Marcus had learned to recognize the thoughts and feelings that preceded his aggressive episodes and to develop alternative responses that didn't involve intimidation or threats. I used to think that if someone disagreed with me or didn't do what I wanted, they were disrespecting me, Marcus told the group. But, Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that people can have different opinions or priorities without it being personal. Not everything is about me. The insight sounded simple, but it had taken months of therapy for Marcus to truly internalize it. His entire social framework had been built around the assumption that he was the center of every interaction and that other people's behavior was primarily a reflection of their attitude toward him. Learning to see situations from other people's perspectives had required fundamentally rewiring his thought patterns. The group session ended with each member making a commitment for the coming week. Marcus's goal was to practice the communication skills he'd been learning in therapy by having difficult conversations without raising his voice or using intimidation tactics. It was harder than it sounded for someone who'd spent decades using his physical presence to win arguments. After the group session, Marcus drove across town to his new job at a non-profit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals find employment and housing. The work was a far cry from the warehouse forklift operation he'd lost after the incident, but it had given him purpose in a way that his previous job never had. The non-profit, called Second Chances, had hired Marcus specifically because of his story. The director, a former social worker named Patricia Johnson, believed that people who'd confronted their own destructive behavior could be powerful advocates for change in others. Marcus worked in the intake department, helping new clients navigate the challenges of re-entering society after prison. Marcus, Patricia said as he arrived for his afternoon shift, "We've got a new client I'd like you to work with. He's coming out after an assault conviction, and I think he might relate to your experience." The client was a 24-year-old named Devin who'd spent 3 years in prison after a bar fight that had nearly killed another man. Like Marcus, Devin was struggling to understand how his need to prove his toughness had led to consequences that had derailed his life. Unlike Marcus, Devin was getting help before his behavior had become a decades-long pattern. "I keep thinking about that night," Devin told Marcus during their intake interview. "I didn't even know the guy I fought. He just said something I didn't like, and I couldn't let it go. Now I've lost 3 years of my life, and for what? To prove I was tough?" Marcus listened with the empathy of someone who understood exactly how Devin felt. 6 months earlier, Marcus might have given advice about standing your ground and not letting people disrespect you. Now, he shared the insights he'd gained from therapy about the difference between strength and aggression, between confidence and intimidation. "The thing I wish someone had told me when I was your age," Marcus said, "is that real strength doesn't look like what we see in movies. Real strength is being able to walk away from fights that don't matter. Real strength is being able to admit when you're wrong. Real strength is treating other people with respect even when they can't make you do it." The conversation with Devin was part of a larger transformation in how Marcus understood masculinity and power. Through therapy, volunteer work, and the humbling experience of rebuilding his life from scratch, he developed a completely different framework for understanding what it meant to be a man. Instead of measuring himself by his ability to intimidate others, Marcus was learning to value his capacity for empathy and emotional growth. Instead of seeing every interaction as a competition to be won, he was practicing collaboration and mutual respect. Instead of using his physical size to control situations, he was developing communication skills that allowed him to navigate conflicts without resorting to intimidation. The changes weren't just philosophical, they were practical and observable. Marcus's new co-workers described him as thoughtful and supportive. His therapist noted significant improvements in his emotional regulation and interpersonal skills. Most importantly, Marcus was beginning to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than fear or dominance. But, perhaps the most significant milestone in Marcus's journey came 8 months after the incident, when he decided to return to the community center. He'd been avoiding the place since his discharge from the hospital, partly from embarrassment and partly from a court order that had temporarily banned him from the premises. But, as part of his therapeutic process, Dr. Rodriguez had encouraged Marcus to make amends to the people he'd harmed, and that meant confronting the community where his behavior had caused so much damage. Marcus called Linda, the community center director, and asked if he could meet with her to discuss what had happened and what he'd learned since then. Linda agreed, though she admitted later that she'd been nervous about the conversation. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus told Linda during their meeting in her small office overlooking the gymnasium where everything had happened. "Not just for that night with Sarah, but 4 months of making this place uncomfortable for people who just wanted to use the facilities peacefully." Linda had seen many apologies over her 12 years as director, most of them hollow attempts to avoid consequences rather than genuine expressions of remorse. But Marcus's apology felt different. He spoke specifically about incidents he remembered, acknowledged the impact his behavior had on individual people, and took full responsibility for choices he'd made over many months. "I've been in therapy," Marcus explained. "Learning about why I acted like that and how to change. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make sure it never happens again." Linda was impressed by Marcus's self-awareness and his commitment to change, but she was also protective of the community members who'd been traumatized by his behavior. Any decision about allowing him to return would need to involve the people who'd been most affected by his actions. "Would you be willing to attend a community meeting?" Linda asked. "Give people a chance to hear from you directly and ask questions about what you've learned?" Marcus agreed, though the prospect terrified him. Speaking publicly about his behavior and its consequences required a level of vulnerability that the old Marcus would never have tolerated. But the new Marcus understood that genuine accountability meant facing the people he'd harmed and accepting whatever response they deemed appropriate. The community meeting was held on a Tuesday evening exactly 9 months after the original incident. About 40 people attended, including many who'd been affected by Marcus's behavior and others who'd followed the story and were curious about this unexpected development. Marcus had prepared remarks, but when he stood up to speak, he found himself departing from his script to address the real people in front of him rather than delivering a generic apology. "I know some of you are here because I made you feel unsafe or unwelcome in your own community center," Marcus began. "I know that some of you stopped coming here because of me, and some of you changed your schedules to avoid me. I want you to know that I understand now how selfish and destructive my behavior was." He spoke for about 10 minutes, describing his therapy experience, his new understanding of respect and consent, and his commitment to continued growth. But, more importantly, he opened himself up to questions and criticism from people who'd been directly affected by his actions. Jennifer Reeves, the mother who'd stopped bringing her daughter to dance class after Marcus cornered her in the parking lot, asked the most direct question: "How do we know you've really changed? How do we know this isn't just you saying what you think we want to hear?" Marcus had anticipated this question, and his answer reflected months of therapeutic work on accountability and behavioral change. "You don't know," he said honestly. "I can tell you about the therapy and the anger management classes and the work I'm doing on myself, but the only way to prove I've changed is through my actions over time. I can't ask you to trust me based on words alone. I have to earn that trust by consistently behaving in ways that make this community safer and more welcoming for everyone." The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, with community members sharing their experiences and asking Marcus difficult questions about his behavior and his commitment to change. Some people were skeptical, others were cautiously optimistic, and a few were openly supportive of giving him a second chance. Sarah Chen had been invited to the meeting but chose not to attend, sending a statement that Linda read aloud: "I believe in the possibility of redemption for people who do the hard work of changing their behavior." If Marcus Thompson has genuinely learned from this experience and is committed to treating others with respect, then he deserves the opportunity to demonstrate that change. However, the decision about whether to welcome him back should belong to the community members who were affected by his actions, not to me. The community ultimately voted to allow Marcus to return to the center on a probationary basis, with the understanding that any return to his previous behavior would result in permanent exclusion. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it reflected a community's willingness to believe in the possibility of genuine change. Marcus's return to the community center was gradual and careful. He started by volunteering for maintenance projects, working quietly to improve the facility without seeking attention or recognition. He attended Linda's communication workshops, participated in community cleanup events, and slowly began rebuilding relationships with people who'd known him only as a source of intimidation. The process was humbling and often uncomfortable, but it was also healing in ways Marcus hadn't expected. For the first time in his adult life, he was participating in a community as a contributor rather than a dominator, and the experience taught him things about connection and belonging that he'd never understood before. A year after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Chen. She was calling to invite him to attend the graduation ceremony for the first group.